All right, fantastic. I am the moderator of this self-organizing panel, which means I have zero value added, and we'll stop immediately. So we'll be talking in the order of seating and 7 minutes apiece, and then we'll open up to questions. Katja, please go ahead. The light should go on. There you go.
Hey. All right, well, thanks for having me here. When I was first invited to be on this panel, the panel was called IO in Antitrust and Policy. And I'm actually just going to talk about the policy piece. If you know anything about my background, I actually, in contrast to Nancy and Fiona, have no direct experience working for one of the antitrust agencies. So I don't feel like super well equipped to talk about that. But I do have a bit more general policy background, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So first of all, what is that? In the transition from the Obama to the first Trump administration, I was the chief economist at the FCC. I spent some time there at the same time when Nancy was actually in DC. And so I have some insight into how an agency like the FCC thinks about economics from that period. Until maybe February, I was also a member of the Academic Research Council at the CFPB. And so I have some insight into how the CFPB thinks about research and wanted to just contrast the two a little bit. So, sort of starting in what might be sort of the most ideal way in which academics and policymakers interact is maybe the spectrum auctions at the FCC, at least in terms of sort of the IO space. That work is really unique, I think, in a number of ways. Academics are clearly very involved, I think, in part because the problems the FCC were thinking about are very well defined, the way an academic thinks about the world, but also extremely challenging in thinking about how we think about complementarities across space, how we think about multiple units being auctioned off at the same time that were maybe not necessarily uniform in characteristics. And so there's a lot of interesting, I think, theory and auction design questions that academics could really contribute nicely. At the same time, I think policymakers were also really dissatisfied with the previous way of allocating spectrum, which opened them up to some interest in engaging with academics. And maybe, sort of from a practical perspective, they also were willing to be quite patient. If you've looked at how long it takes to put in a spectrum auction together, that's oftentimes a multi-year prospect. There's very few other policy efforts that I know that are so long in their nature. And so I think that led to a really nice marriage of academic work and policy work that mostly was theoretical in nature. And I think that I wanted to just comment a little bit on why that is. There's obviously really nice empirical work in this space. So I have, for example, Jeremy's paper with Pat Bajari on there. Mo Chao also has a nice paper that thinks about estimating complementarities in the 700 megahertz spectrum auction. Oftentimes the FCC, however, is interested in a prospective analysis. They want to know if I run this particular auction, what is going to happen? And so for that, actually, IO techniques are not so well suited. We're kind of backward looking, assessing whether it was good. They want to be forward looking, thinking about what would happen if they did X. And so, Oli and Mike and I have a paper on the incentive auction where we try to take more of their approach and we estimated valuations and, just purely from profitability data, not backing it out from equilibrium conditions, the way I think the IO literature tends to do, and ran with that approach. That's not something I think our referees were too impressed by, but is something that I think is more in line with what the policymaker needs to do. And I think it'd be interesting to think about how these two approaches compare in terms of what they actually yield. So, that's sort of, I think, the ideal place for an academic to influence policy where IO has had real implications. Most of the other policy efforts the FCC engages in, I think, have seen input from academics, but at a less direct way. And I think that reflects many of the resource constraints that an agency like the FCC or the CFPB face. I thought I'd just point out three, and that's how I've organized sort of my examples there. I think the first place where IO economists can really contribute is just in the detail of data that they are able to access and exploit in ways that an agency like the FCC cannot necessarily as easily. And so my examples on your left are examples of that. So, for example, Aviv Niveau and John Williams have a really nice set of papers that think about estimating in detail demand for broadband services, trying to apply that to regulations like internet content discrimination regulations. For that, you need to observe individual level data and think about distribution and demand. That's not something that a regulator typically has access to. Similarly, Marlene Mara has a nice paper that I have there where they construct their data based off freedom of information requests. That's something the FCC could do, but just takes a really long time. And so they don't have the ability to really do something like that. And so I think one way in which academic research has really contributed is in bringing detailed evidence to these types of matters that the FCC in-house could not necessarily really assess. The second place that I think IO research has made real contributions is in addressing the second big constraint of a regulator, which is time. And here I'll just sort of point to John Elliott and Paul Scott's work on thinking about what the implications of market structure are in the telecom industry. Their paper thinks about the wireless setting and to what extent a wireless merger might, while it of course increases market power, also allow you to realize efficiencies that are very particular to the wireless setting. And so they really have a nice marriage of an engineering model of how wireless traffic travels, how that relates to your spectrum holdings, how that feeds into quality of service and demand. Those are all, I think, really important pieces that the regulator cares about, but doesn't have the time or resources to really assess. And so I think more work in this space around what a merger or concentration does to investment is something that would be very welcome, but is sort of beyond, I think, their in-house capabilities. And then lastly, I'll just say the other place where I think IO can really help is in offering expertise. And here I'll just talk a little bit about the CFPB related topics that I have on the right. The CFPB is actually an amazing agency in many ways. I'm sure you've all read about the resources that they command. One of the things that they have done with their resources is actually acquired lots of very detailed data that an agency like the FCC must be jealous of. And what they've, I think, done quite successfully is collaborate with researchers to use these data to answer questions that are of interest to them. And so I'll just point to my second and first papers that I have up there. The Nelson paper thinks about, for example, what limiting ability of credit card companies to price to consumer behavior does to market outcomes. He did this work as a PhD student embedded at the CFPB. This is very traditional sort of IO work, the way Steve laid it out yesterday in terms of how a paper is structured. That's this kind of paper. The CFPB has lots of people who are interested in consumer behavior. They have much fewer people who would be able to estimate this kind of a model, but they're quite interested in assessing the overall implications of policies that they put in place. And I think that's one place where we can really contribute. Similarly, Tobias Salz has a paper that he collaborated on with CFPB researchers, where he used their data to think about the auto credit loan market and how auto dealers serve as intermediaries in getting the consumer both the car and financing. This data used administrative data from the CFPB, and I think was hopefully meant to be as an effort into trying to think about whether we should do something about auto dealers' ability to influence financing offers for consumers. The last thing I'll just say is, of course, policy making happens in a place of, the political environment. So there's definitely areas that I think the previous administration was interested in that I don't think the new administration will be interested in. My box in blue there at the bottom that I've labeled consumer behavior is maybe one such example. There's been a lot of interest, I think, in the IO literature in trying to think about measuring frictions in consumer behavior, be it because of different contracting terms, like in Tobias's example, be it about consumers not foreseeing properly what their behavior might be down the road. The Biden administration, I think, really ran with that. And put quite a lot of effort into trying to think about, for example, junk fee regulations that both of the agencies I'm familiar with, I think, were influenced by. Like I said, I don't think that's necessarily going to be a priority of the new administration. But one thing I want you to take away just from some of the resources, some of the papers I've listed here is I think, policy interests come and go, and it's actually quite useful to have a stock of existing work out there that can speak to different issues if and when they become politically relevant again in the future. So that's all I had. I'm going to pass it on to Nancy.
Is this on? Yeah. So thrilled to be part of this panel. I'm going to transition to antitrust, which is where I've spent most of my time and attention over the past 10 or 12 years in terms of work that I'm doing, although I've been teaching in that space for decades. And I want to highlight, before we dig into the contributions of modern empirical structural IO, just how well suited IO is to contribute to the antitrust enforcement debate and agenda. So, first, our work tends to almost exclusively be industry specific. It recognizes heterogeneity in a broad variety of dimensions, but across markets in particular. And that's very well suited to the kind of facts and circumstance specific setting that antitrust cases take place in, where it doesn't help a decision maker, whether that be DOJ, the FTC, or a judge, to know that on average, something happens in a particular market. They want to know, in the context of, say, a particular merger or a particular type of exclusionary conduct, what's the impact? And I think that our approach to questions and to empirical analysis is very well suited to that. So in that context, it is, I think, not a matter of dispute at all that kind of modern structural IO tools and methods and approaches have advanced antitrust enforcement, particularly with respect to merger simulation. I should say it complements, I think, something else that has been true of IO for a long time, which is that we marry applied theory with empirical approaches and econometric estimates, and that's really the foundation of kind of the work that you heard so much about yesterday in so many settings. So being theory grounded is really helpful in terms of getting these tools into the hands of people that can use them. I would say while we've advanced the enforcement agenda, I'm going to give you a kind of few specific examples in just a second. But yeah, so you can see I'm not going to talk about these specific papers, and there are tons in any one of these actions that I could have put in instead of the ones that are cited to here, but just to give you a sense for the dialogue between academic work and antitrust enforcement. I will say the one thing that I think we could use a lot more of, there are a lot of merger retrospectives that are done, either kind of diffs and diffs style or structural based merger retrospectives like Nate Miller and Matt Weinsberg, terrific paper on the Miller-Coors joint venture. But I don't think that we've got very many examples where we applied the tools to say, what would we have predicted ex ante about this merger? What were the actual effects? And why might there be a gap if there's a gap? And I think that if I were sort of making a wish list of places where the Academy would put a little bit more effort, that would be one that I would move to. So how have kind of the advances in the toolkit diffused to enforcement? First, I would say kind of slowly, and that's because competition policy enforcement in the US has to go through a federal district court judge. The people that you've been reading about in the paper over the last few months, whose typical case is not an antitrust case. I've heard statistics, I can't find the source of it, but that say that the federal district court judge hearing a merger challenge is typically hearing his or her first antitrust case. So in olden days, I would have said they were hearing, cases against drug dealers or white collar crime. Now they're hearing challenges to a whole set of this administration's attempt to destroy many of our civil institutions. But they're not accustomed to thinking about competition policy. So it has to be, for these tools to diffuse, what has to be the case? First, they need to be robust. And that's because for those of you who've been going through the referee process on your papers and you think, oh my God, that's so excruciating, let me tell you that if you're proposing some empirical project in merger litigation, say, what the econometric referees put you through looks anemic by comparison. You're going to hand over all of your data, all of your code to an adversary who wants to shoot holes in everything that you've done. And so if your method does not produce robust results, it's not going to be deployed effectively in litigation. Secondly, you need to be able to explain and defend the assumptions, and they need to match the empirical setting quite well. Third, the data that are available to you have to be suitable to applying these techniques. And what do I mean by that? Well, you're in a really big time crunch. Even the most sophisticated, long-standing, drawn-out merger investigations last less than a year. And so you've got to go from kind of start to finish within that time space. And that means that if you're working with a merger, say in an industry like hospitals or health insurance, particularly Medicare-related markets, consumer packaged goods, grocery stores, you're going to have data sets that you can pretty quickly pull up to analyze the effects or simulate the effects of that merger. But if you're in other industries where you're going to be subpoenaing data from companies and it's going to come in a mess and every company is going to have data in a different format and they're going to have different products and you're not going to know what the characteristics of those products are, you may not be able to use these techniques because you'd spend your entire investigatory year just kind of cleaning a data set before you even started the estimation. So that turns out to be important. Concomitant with that is that if you can look at kind of single company behavior where all of the data you're going to use for that analysis comes in from one company, you're going to be in better shape to sort of use these types of models. So this might be a reason why kind of settings where auction or bid models are appropriate, where you might be able to pull a company's customer management system and they'll record kind of win-loss data and who their primary competitors are, kind of all within that system. And it might be very quick for you to then apply some of these methods. So what's the implication of all of this? Demand estimation is probably the greatest export of structural IO to antitrust enforcement, but it still gets used in a very small number of cases relative to the universe of actions. And think nested logit, not BLP, right? So again, something that's pretty simple and relatively robust. If I think about all of the airline investigations and mergers that DOJ has investigated, I believe, I haven't completely confirmed this, but I believe that the first example of expert testimony based on estimating a demand model was Nate Miller's testimony in the American JetBlue Northeast Alliance litigation in 2022, 2023. So there'd been a lot of airline mergers before that, but they hadn't deployed these approaches, nor did the one right after that, which was the JetBlue Spirit merger, use this. So, just some sense of caution here. And I will say, an example of kind of where these various criteria that I've explained didn't get checked off was, since we just heard about washing machines, we'll talk about another appliance merger, the proposed acquisition of General Electric's appliance division by Electrolux, which Mike Winston was the DOJ expert on. And when Mike got pulled into this, I believe that his intended plan was to estimate a discrete choice model of appliance choice. And as he began to see the data pour in and thought about what would be involved in trying to put together a data set that would enable him to estimate that model, he not only backed off of that plan, but the testimony at trial was based on upward pricing pressure analysis, which those of you who've looked at any type of antitrust tools is an extraordinarily simple tool based on rough estimates of markups and diversion ratios and simulating a merger effect again, not the magnitude of the effect, but just the upward pricing pressure that would be caused by the merger. The final thing I just want to say before I turn it over to Fiona, who may disagree with a lot of what I've just said, is that I think there's been enormous complementarity between where a lot of the academic work is focused in advancing structural methods with advances in what I'll call non-structural data analysis. So I think of Tom Woolman's work on mergers of a broad variety of sorts and how influential that has been to the debate over enforcement and indeed to where enforcers are looking. In labor markets, there's been some really nice structural work done on labor market power by Steve Barry and Ioana Marinescu and Jose Azar. But I think in terms of advancing the notion of labor market power and how we think about it in mergers, the more diffs and diffs merger retrospectives done by Ellie Prager and Matt Schmidt and by David Arnold have had at least as much impact in terms of really bringing it to an antitrust context. There have been a wealth of merger retrospectives that almost all rely on diffs and diffs methods, increasingly sophisticated in applying the advances that other fields have brought to that kind of analysis. In that space, and I can't help but give a shout out to Vivek Bhattacharya, Gaston Ayanis, and their colleague Stillman's paper on consumer product goods, which is a nice bridge between our, we want to focus on one narrow industry or one narrow merger, but we'd like to generalize our results, which is a huge failure of IO. We do almost nothing to generalize our results, which is why the concentration debate got taken over by macroeconomists and labor economists. But they have a nice approach of looking at consumer product mergers across a broad setting, number of mergers to try and tell us what does it look like the distribution of price effects looks like. And then finally, I'll mention two strands of work that came out in the Google search trial, the role of behavioral economics and the importance of that in the initial liability decision, and then experiments. And I can't help but do a shout out to the work that's done by Hunt Alcott and others that looks at how alternative remedies might play out in search and highlight something that we knew from, again, diffs and diff studies, but that if you're just giving consumers choice, we're not going to move the needle at all. Or if you're just eliminating Google's ability to buy exclusive default search contracts, you're probably not going to move the needle at all. And I think that's really advanced some of the discussion. We'll wait and see what impact that has on the court in the remedy hearing, which is closing in Washington today.
Okay, I guess it's my turn. Thank you very much for the invitation. I agree with everything so far, so that's might not have so much debate. I think I'll divide my remarks into proof of concept, some kind of particular examples, and then a call for for work going forward. I think a lot of what happens with the modern IO toolkit is showing that something can be done, both that it can be done and then the kind of answer that you get from it, which makes for a generalizable idea, even if that idea was proven empirically in a specific context. And that generalizable idea is really important for an enforcer trying to think of a theory of harm in a particular instance. So it has a broader impact. Something that isn't quite in that category, but I think is worth telling you about is when the draft merger guidelines were put out, there was a guideline that said if there's a trend in concentration, then the merger can be illegal. And I and a number of other people wrote in and said, I'm not quite sure what, like if there's a trend in concentration because the technology of this producing this product is changing and so minimum efficient scale is rising, for example, then the antitrust division can't really stop that. So it's not an appropriate thing to have as a guideline in the merger guidelines. And I wasn't the only person saying that. And the final guidelines got rid of it and said it's a factor to consider, which is of course fine if you want to have a factor consider. But that tells you the length of time between Harold Demsetz writing a paper and the merger guidelines reflecting it. Okay. So I would say that the most useful place for in antitrust enforcement for demand estimation and merger simulation is in the first phase of an investigation when the staff are trying to figure out what the right answer is. So the agency goes from being the neutral social planner into, if the merger is bad, bringing a case. So in the neutral social planner stage, there's more time. The parties typically try to do something. Then the parties bring that into the agency that says, give us all your code, give us your data. The staff economists try to replicate it, think about what might be right or not right. And that's a very important input into the decision whether or not to sue, but it's not then so important in litigation. And that's for the reason that Nancy was just describing. I'm going to give you a few specific examples of different ways in which this manifests itself. I recently was an expert in a rate hearing. So how much do internet radio stations have to pay for songs? And it was kind of cool because what happened was essentially what I can't remember who described yesterday, but we did the client did an experiment. How much can I steer music across different labels? You get a useful, actually robust number out of that. You can drop it into a model, and you can get out of that a number that is very useful to the decision maker. How much would prices move under certain conditions? So I thought that was a very good example of what we can do with our tools. It wasn't complicated actually, but it was quite rigorous. I was also the expert for the merging parties in a handbag case. This was very interesting because there are a lot of handbags sold in America. Some of them are very expensive. They're extremely differentiated. And the problem with trying to figure out whether there was going to be harm from this differentiated products merger is no one knew what the denominator was, because there's no agency or regulator or safety issue with handbags. And so everybody and his brother sells handbags, and they come in the gray market. They come in with duplicates that are not illegal, but similar. They come in used. They come in every kind of price. And the result of that was a sort of a chaos. And it was, this is an example of Nancy's point that sometimes you just don't have the data to figure out something. It was not possible to do an empirical study. So that was disappointing, and that ended up being a merger that could only rely on documents. The Google Ad Tech case, I think there, because the possibility to out-resource the government was very large, the government took an approach to avoid using structural methods. So remember that if the problem is complex and there's a lot of different robustness tests you want to do and gather data and so on, and the merging parties can pour literally 20 times more money on the problem than the government, they're going to win every time it's tool against tool. So I think in Google Ad Tech, the possibility of having Paul Milgram and, with 1,000 assistants providing lots of reports that show that all these different auctions were actually good for some reason was a very live problem, and therefore the government chose to bring the case first as a jury trial, which ended up not happening, but then in the rocket docket, which means that you have a year to get ready and the trial lasts a week. Okay, in a week, you can't put an auction theorist on the stand, no matter how good an expositor they are, because they can't teach the judge enough in a week to make that realistic. So you have to, again, go with the documents, and the documents say we're trying to, cut off the air supply of our competitor, and that's what the case ended up being about. So that's an example of how our tools won't get used. There's also a limit to what you can estimate, even if you have the right experts and resources on both sides. So consider the Microsoft Activision merger, where I helped Microsoft in the agency part, not in the actual trial piece. But the theory of, so remember, Activision was a video game maker. Microsoft wanted to buy them, did buy them. And the theory of harm turned on whether Microsoft, who had a 25% share in the console gaming industry in the United States, was going to withhold Call of Duty from Sony with the 75% share. Now, we all know Robin Lee's paper about how the entrant can use an exclusive to gain and grow because of the two-sided network effects. You got to have some stuff before you can attract people, and then the people attract more stuff, and so you get a positive feedback loop. But the FTC wanted to block the merger on the grounds that an exclusive for Call of Duty on the part of Microsoft would be anti-competitive and hurt Sony. And Robin was the FTC's expert in that case. But the empirical advance, the ability to do this two-sided network effects, ended up not being part of the empirical work used in the trial, I think probably because of the time element. So the analysis relied on the normal vertical arithmetic, like in the cable paper of Robin and co-authors. How many people would change to Microsoft's hardware in response to an exclusive, and how much would you make on would Microsoft make on that? So there's just limits to the use of our more advanced tools in litigation because of the context. I'll finish up by just saying something about going forward. Yesterday, Rob Porter mentioned briefly about finding cartels in the wild with tools like our models of how the cartel ought to behave, and then trying to figure out empirically distinguishing collusion from competition using those tools. There is a European enthusiasm and some other places enthusiasm for taking cartels we know and love and work on all of the milk and stamps and oil drilling and so on, and deploying AI on that data set somehow, and using that, then releasing that AI out into the world to search for cartels. I think that seems hard. And so if anybody has a good idea for making that easier, I think that would be laudable. But it's hard not only, I think, as an empirical problem, but remember, because cartel behavior sends somebody to jail, the evidence that you need to convict is not going to be somebody's structural model of cartels. It's going to have to be much more than that. So it would be a kind of a screening. I think you'd have to imagine that if we got good at that, it would be a screen, and then you'd go out and put a wire on somebody and send them into the meeting. Another place where we need more tools is behavioral. This was mentioned earlier too. I think our consumer choice frameworks are not very realistic very often, and especially in the digital context, firms are really good at figuring out how to make people make the choices that they want. And then lastly, and maybe I don't want to say most importantly, but I feel very strongly when you go into this world how many more tools and how much more equipment we have to handle unilateral effects rather than coordinated effects. We just have nothing to say about coordinated effects. And it's very frustrating. I mean, more concentration is worse. If you want to collude, fewer firms can collude more easily. That's basically all we know. And we have so much machinery for a lot of other issues, and I really wish that we had more there. So I would say this panel, I hope, just to summarize a little bit, the policy context is way easier. It's way slower. Okay, it's slower, and you can build up a body of evidence so that when somebody comes along and wants to do policy, whether that's the federal government, perhaps not right now, but the states are very active right now. Oregon just passed a law about limiting private equity's ability to do roll-ups in healthcare, for example. That was surely influenced by a number of people's work in this room. So that's a really good place. I think we're not doing very well with litigation, sophisticated models in litigation. And I look forward to hearing about how well we do telling profit maximizing firms how to maximize profits better later on in the day.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Questions? Give you a mic.
You set up this dichotomy between these super sophisticated tools, computational tools that are being developed in IO, and the kind of simple rules of thumb, or like maybe mostly theoretical insights that are often used in practice, given the sort of hard constraints of antitrust litigation. I wonder if you think that there's, AI aside, scope for developing tools within the confines of IO using some combination of theory and sophisticated modeling to do something in between, and what you imagine those kinds of tools might look like.
I mean, we have middle ground tools like UPP and things like that, where you say, I'm going to take an estimate of diversion, and I'm going to take something about margins, and I'm going to get myself a good sense of whether I have a problem or not. So I think those are very high value tools, and we have some of them. More would be better. You agree? Yes. Yeah.
So sometimes it feels like relative to our colleagues in macro or applied micro, I think it's a little harder for IO economists to interact with, policy in a way that's different from, I understand we can talk to the folks at the agencies, and that's been the direct line for a while. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. And I was thinking more along the lines of like, I guess you could write a JEP, but there isn't really an IO section of Brookings or of any of these other think tanks that seem to translate the work of the people in this room to the policy space.
First thing I wanted to actually correct, there is an IO-ish policy section of Brookings. They think today mostly about AI. So, and so that's the markets and regulation section at Brookings. So there's definitely scope there. I think the other thing I would say is, I think oftentimes policymakers attempt to engage without a response. So the thing the FCC always found very annoying is they would send out seminar invitations and people would actually not respond. So I think there's ways in which you can engage. The other thing I would also say is I found it very helpful because the typical approach, I think, when we do counterfactuals is we kind of say, here's my counterfactual, let me compare it to first best, and there's something, right? If you go and talk to a policymaker, they're like, yeah, this is totally useless. We could never do this. And so I think it's engaging is A, I think feasible, and B, I think is helpful in making us write better papers if we want them to have impact. So that's sort of a few things I would say. But, I think the other thing that maybe your comment reflects a little bit is it's not clear that the returns to engaging in policy are maybe what they need to be or what they maybe are in a field like macro. We've, I think, traditionally been quite methods heavy. That's not something that's so much about the substance. And so, maybe there's scope for adjusting that a little bit over time.
Yeah. So first, I want to not downplay I guess you could talk to the agencies, right? So to echo Katja's point, both the FTC and the DOJ in the antitrust sphere are stacked with dozens and dozens of PhD economists, many of whom have been trained in IO, and they are, to the extent they can, reading the literature. They are eager to hear about academic advances. Again, whether they can implement those directly in their litigation or not, they want to understand, where the field is, what they might be able to pick up. They have no budget. So if you can package, either self-finance a trip to Washington or package it with something else and give a seminar at the agency, I will guarantee you that you will, if you're speaking to them on an industry where their expertise is, so the FTC and DOJ kind of divide the world in bizarre and incomprehensible ways, to the point when I would go to when I went to DOJ, my husband would see a merger come up and he's like, "Oh, so I see you're getting this merger." I would say, no, that's the FTC. And a little while longer, he would say, "Oh, I see this merger. That must be going to the FTC." I'm like, no, that's us. But if you're speaking to them on something that is within their industry expertise, you will get more sophisticated comments on your paper than you would get anywhere else. I mean, you'll have, many people in the room who will know more about the details of the setting that you're studying, even if it was your job market paper. They may not be as frontier on methods, but they'll know a lot about the industry. So I would encourage that interaction. I think it's a great way to get both your message, your research, and out and sort of do some public service along with it. And in terms of, what you do beyond that, we were actually having a little bit of discussion about before the session. I would not encourage those of you pre-tenure to spend a lot of time on this, but it's similar to the advice I got when I started out as a junior faculty member, which was, why are you going to that policy conference? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. But afterwards, where you've got a little bit more, longer horizon and time and space, I think a lot about how to translate your work into accessible forms. Again, not so much for the agency economists, because they'll pick it up, I think, regardless, but kind of to a broader group of people and influence the policy debate. And I would just say, when I came back from DOJ, I decided I had much more to contribute in translating economic research and insights to the lawyers than I had to talking to economists, because I felt like you guys know a lot of what the lawyers don't. Fiona has done a tremendous job in both the Thurman Arnold Center, but also other activities that she's done. I'll let her talk about them. But in terms of bringing people, lawyers and economists together to write on topics to try and kind of advance the enforcement agenda. But you could write papers for, say, Antitrust magazine or some of the other ABA outlets that would reach some of the lawyers and enforcers and potentially the clerks that you might need to influence. So I would definitely say it's not a lost cause, and it's I think a great way to sort of push your work forward.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think the translation of our work into people who are not only non-economists, but not even in this subfield of economics, is really bad. We all write that last paragraph that says policy implications, and it's a paragraph at the end of a 50-page paper. That is just a joke. I'm sorry to say it, but it is. Like, anyone who's not us isn't reading the paper, so they're not at the last paragraph. And if they did, they wouldn't understand it anyway. So the thing that needs to be written is a wholly different piece of output, delivered through a wholly different distribution channel to a wholly different set of people. And so again, that's not a pre-tenure thing to do. But there's a tremendous shortage of translational capacity. Just the number, after I left DOJ and I would go to conferences and people would say things like, there's no such thing as predatory pricing, or, there's no such thing as tacit collusion, or there's no such thing. Pick any
or
outrageous.
Or all vertical mergers are pro-competitive.
Just they would assert things about the literature that were not true, and my whole job was to raise my hand and say, actually, that's not true. Whereupon they just closed their mouth because this was not a thing that they were actually expert in. They were just repeating stuff that somebody had told them before. So there's a lot of misinformation and just lack of current information. And the proof of concept idea is extremely important to get across, because the lawyer who reads about Tom Woolman's paper about dialysis mergers that are happening under the threshold might have a client with a similar case. And if they have read about how those mergers exist and why they could be illegal, then that person can more naturally make an analogy to the situation they're in. So I would say that the writing with lawyers and for lawyers is a really good use of time once you have tenure, and when you have a situation that your paper covers that could be the basis for an antitrust case. And it's easy to find a lawyer co-author. They do all the work. You just make sure that the economics is correct in the paper. They figure out what makes it illegal, and you have a law review publication.
And if you're writing for law reviews, the only review that the editors put you through is to make sure that your footnotes all cite check. So if you're tired of going through
there's no referee
the IO referee process.
And let me just say one more thing. The law review context is also extremely important for the ability of the agency, the people inside the agency, to develop their theory of harm and get it through. So John Baker and I wrote a paper about platform MFNs, which are when Amazon says, if you merchant list on our platform at $100, you can't list on a rival platform for less than $100. And we explained why that was anti-competitive. The state of California sued relatively soon thereafter. Eventually, the FTC sued. The motion to dismiss in California, which is when Amazon says this case doesn't make any sense, there's nothing here. Amazon lost that. The state of California won it. And my paper with John was in several footnotes in the brief that California put in, and the court cited to it. It didn't say anything any of you didn't already know. There was no new economics in that paper, but it was published in the Yale Law Journal. So it was something that all the lawyers and the court felt very comfortable with. So you can have a tremendous impact doing that.
Yeah, and to that point, it doesn't have to be your latest, greatest structural econometrics paper. So to Fiona's point, one of the things I was very frustrated with when I was at the DOJ was that the lawyers were extremely reluctant to allege upstream harm from a merger, so that the merger of two buyers might harm the people that were selling output to them, or workers who were providing labor to them. They somehow had a concern that maybe that was an efficiency, which none of us would call anti-competitive reduction in prices you were paying upstream because of the reduction of competition, of bargaining leverage from monopsony power and efficiency. But they felt really exposed. And I wrote a paper with Scott Hemphill at NYU that explained that no, this was both within the law and certainly within the economics to bring these types of challenges. And, immediately had conversations with enforcers all over the globe about, we've been worrying about labor markets. We've been hearing concern about labor markets. Can you come talk to us about how we might bring these types of cases? So again, this is like, maybe it's not Econ 101, but it's not a whole lot removed from that. But you can have an impact in just bringing your insights into how to think about competition among firms, which is our core, what we come back to, and influence enforcement policy in a really positive way, I think.
Thank you very much.